be here and see you all, and also to share my thoughts with you. I hope you read somewhere about what we are going to talk about, huh? I am in the process of writing a book which I call, at the moment, the title is Buddhism Demystified. And there I have several parts to it. The first part is to talk about Buddhism as a religion. The other one is to talk about Buddhism as a philosophy. Then the other part, Buddhism as a psychology. And then I speak about psychotherapy. It's a Buddhist. And then I talk about the practice of Buddhism. Now, the practice of Buddhism here involves understanding what Buddhism is. Now, if we don't understand what the teaching of the Buddha is, we cannot really practice it properly. I know a lot of people who come to learn meditation and they just sit. If you ask, what are you doing? They say, I'm sitting. So that means you are ignorant of the teaching of the Buddha and you are just trying to practice, hoping that at the end of it, you will be enlightened. So, but that is not the real teaching of the Buddha. The Buddha said, I don't teach like leading a blind man. You can take a stick and ask a blind man to hold one end and you hold the other end and you can just take him someplace. The Buddha said, that's not the way I do it. It's like a surgeon who operates on the eye and gets the person to see for himself. And then you don't have to lead him really. And that person will know how to go and where to go. So in a similar way, the Buddha's method is not just like leading the blind. First comes the enlightenment. Later comes the awakening really. Now the enlightenment and the awakening are two different things. To be enlightened is like you supposing this is a dark place and you are sleeping here in the dark. I come and switch on the light. That doesn't mean that you are going to wake up. So I have to wake you up and then you'll be able to see. So in a similar way, the enlightenment is simply like giving a map for you to go wherever you want to go. And it's only when you start going that you begin to see the real places. So in the same way, the teaching of the Buddha is really a guide for you to go to the right place. So here we have three main parts to this. What is a Buddha? What is his teaching? and how did he influence humanity? These are the, and then we have 5 parts to each. So we'll have about 15 talks. I hope at the end of it you will have a good knowledge of what Buddhism is as a religion, really. I have found that most of the books that I read, some written by Western Buddhists or maybe scholars, and some written by Buddhists themselves. And very often we find that Buddhism or the teaching of the Buddha is not properly represented in those books. And the other thing is that what I am talking about is not Theravada, Mahayana, or Vajrayana. I am talking about what I see as the original teaching of the Buddha. Because these 3 forms of Buddhism that you find today, there are 3 kinds of interpretation of the teaching of the Buddha. 3 main scholars who interpreted. One was the Theravada was really interpreted by a person called Buddhaghosa. And the Mahayana was mainly influenced by the interpretation of Asanga. And the Vajrayana mainly by Nagarjuna. So that's how we have to see it. But I am trying to interpret the original teaching of the Buddha. So I am not really trying to interpret by changing anything or taking just a part of what the Buddha said, but the whole of it. But I don't say that you should accept what I say. You could find out for yourself. And there is a good test that the Buddha himself has suggested to find out whether this is the genuine teaching of the Buddha. It's very easy because the Buddha is talking about a problem that every human being is suffering from. It's a psychological problem. And I assume that you are also suffering from that same problem. And when you understand this teaching, if you feel that is able to solve your problem, that is the best test. If it solves your problem, then you can be sure that it is the teaching of the Buddha. Because the Buddha's teaching was able to solve the problems of several people during his time. And a person who completely solves the problem, because these problems cannot be solved all at once, because it's a matter of growth and evolution of your mind or your consciousness. And this growth cannot take place at once. Just like you plant a seed in the ground, it's not going to grow next day. You might be able to see something coming up, maybe a small leaf or something coming up, but you don't expect it to grow in one day. So in a similar way, but still you will be able to notice that you are improving in some way, and also that you'll be enlightened to a certain extent. You'll begin to understand. Now, when I say enlightenment, I'm not talking about some mysterious thing that is going to happen to you, but it's simply that you'll begin to understand yourself and your problem better and the solution to it. That's the important thing. So, in beginning this talk, I want to start by talking about evolution. Now, you have heard about the modern theory of evolution, which is Darwin's theory of evolution. And there are some basic things that you'll begin to understand as you study that theory, which is very much in line with the Buddha's way of thinking, and not only thinking, but also about what he did. Right? So, when we talk about evolution, we can start from different points in this process. But I will start just from the time when life began to evolve in this world. Now, before we can understand how life evolved, we also have to understand what life is. If we don't know what life is, we won't be able to understand how life evolved. Now, some people think that life is some mysterious force that is present inside us. But that's not the meaning of life, according to modern biological thinking. Life is an activity. That's the important thing to understand. Life is an activity. Now, this activity, in very short, is taking in food, digesting food, and assimilating that food that has been digested. Then there is the breaking up of what has been digested, again, like the breaking up of sugar molecules to produce energy, and that energy is used for the growth. And also, there is a certain amount of sensitivity, and that sensitivity is able to direct the organism to various places like light or just a healthy environment, and to avoid dangers, and also to find food and that sort of thing. So this is what we call nutrition. We call it breaking down of molecules. We call it respiration. And we also have growth. We have what is called reproduction. And sensitivity in the form of a nervous system and brain we have. All this is what we call life, that whole activity. Right? Now, so this is just a very simple definition of life I gave you to start with. And when we talk about the origin of life, if you are familiar with modern science like physics, chemistry, biology, you'll be able to understand what I am saying easily. Now, when we talk about the beginning of life, the first thing is to understand that in this world, what we call matter, we have two things we call matter and the other we call energy. So the energy is what activates matter. That's what energy is. So energy is also not some kind of special mysterious force, but it is simply the activity itself is energy. I don't want to go deeply into this part. If you want to ask any questions later, you'll be able to ask and I will try to answer. The important thing is to understand that everything that we find today is found in the form of molecules. And these molecules are made up of atoms. Right? And now they have a classification of the different kinds of atoms. And so they have discovered new atoms in the modern world, things that were unknown earlier. And so the important thing is to understand that these different molecules have different properties, different ways of behavior. That is the difference between different substances. And one fine day, when certain conditions that are necessary for a particular kind of molecule to be formed, a special kind of molecule was formed, which had a property very different from all the other molecules that were there. And this molecule was able to absorb atoms from its surrounding and produce molecules of its own kind. So when the first molecule was formed, it was able to absorb atoms from outside and produce molecules of its own kind. And this is the beginning of what is called nutrition. So when these molecules were formed, these molecules also broke down to produce energy. And that energy was used to produce more molecules. And the more the molecules, gradually it became growth. So what is called growth was the addition of molecules. But every molecule that is formed also breaks down. So what happened was, there were two processes going on, the building up process and the breaking down process. That building up process was called anabolism, and the breaking down process is called catabolism. And both together is called metabolism. So as the molecules, of course, were formed, then the molecules multiplied, and so a unit like that, which is able to produce more molecules and grow up, that is what is called an organism. That means these molecules came together to form tissues. Tissues, and the tissues began to form different organs, and gradually the evolution became more and more complicated. And of course, if you go into a detailed study of evolution, you'll begin to understand how gradually different kinds of organisms were formed, and also these organisms began to form a species, and different species of animals and also plants began to grow, until we find the formation of the human being. And when it came to the human being, we find a lot of things have happened during this process, taking millions and millions of years. But the important thing is that the human being, with the coming of the human being, you find 5 senses: the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, and the body. And through these senses, the human being began to become conscious. To become conscious is to be able to see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and also think. That's the evolution of the human being. Now the point is that there is something to be observed in this process. And that thing to be observed is that every organism that was formed has to die. But there is always a struggle to exist. So there is the struggle to exist, and what is called the survival of the fittest. But actually, it is not a permanent survival. You may be fit, but still, what survives is not an individual. What survives is only a species, a generation. But sometimes whole generations are destroyed. Now, when you hear about the ancient animals who have disappeared, you're familiar with one like that? Sometimes children like to go and see these things in museums. What do you call that? Dinosaurs, that's right. So like that, so whole species also sometimes are destroyed. But the main point here is that everything is an impermanent process that is going on. What remains is not an individual or a species. What remains is simply the struggle to exist. That's the important thing. What remains is the struggle to exist. But although there is the struggle to exist, there is always the disappointment. So the struggle and the disappointment, that is all there is. And if we try to analyze and see whether there is any particular individual that there is anything inside to be permanent, there is nothing. But the point is that we never really look at this reality of life. This is a reality that is going on. But we never think of our impermanence. We always think or imagine that we are always going to live forever. We are always thinking in terms of permanence. We always think in terms of happiness, permanent happiness. We make plans to have all this permanent happiness, and we find that we are disappointed at the end. This is the nature of life. Existence. Are we really existing? That's the point. The existence itself seems to be an illusion. But we think we are existing. It's like a wave. Does a wave exist? We know there's a thing called water, but where there is wave in the water, it's just a thing that is transient. It's just passing. So our life is also like that. Our whole life starts with birth and ends in death. And in between is aging. At the beginning we call it growing up to the point of youth, and then from there on is a gradual growing, means growing old, then falling sick and dying. Or we might die in so many other ways. But the important thing is that it's all a change. And we have these senses that we are troubled with, because we are born with eyes we begin to experience three kinds of sensation: pleasant, unpleasant, and a neutral sensation. When the sensation is pleasant, we like that. We want it, desire it. When the sensation is unpleasant, we hate it. We don't like it. And when the sensation is neutral, we don't like it, nor do we hate it. But it is there just to make us feel that we are existing. That's all that the neutral sensation can do for us. We feel that is my basic nature is the neutral sensation. And pleasure and pain come and go. But because we like the pleasant sensation and we hate the unpleasant sensation, what do? We try to maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain. We go on seeking pleasure in the form of comforts of various kinds, and we try to get rid of the discomfort. But however much we try, we can never avoid discomfort, and we can never have permanent pleasure. This is the problem. So the best thing that we can do is to pray. Pray to God, whom we think is the creator of the world. This is the problem. You see, ancient times, people thought thunder, lightning, earthquakes, tornadoes, or various other natural phenomena occur because there are some spirits controlling this whole world. That's how people thought. There were spirits controlling the world, and the whole idea of creation itself was like that. But as human beings began to evolve, as the intelligence improved, they started a thing called science. And with the coming of science, these human beings began to discover how things happen, how rain occurs. They began to see how the water in the ocean evaporates and forms clouds. And these clouds, after some time, begin to cool, and then rain falls down. And this rain that comes down is again carried in the rivers and goes back to the ocean. So it becomes a cycle. The water in the ocean again rises up. So everything is happening in cycles like this, one leading to the other. And now people know that everything is happening due to the presence of the necessary conditions. And this fact is today called determinism. That is the meaning of the word determinism. Now, some people think when I use the word determinism, that means predeterminism. Predeterminism means that someone determined how these things should happen and then it happens. It's like the creator concept. This is, we are talking about determinism, which means everything that happens because of the presence of certain conditions. It was determined by the presence of the necessary conditions. That is what determinism is all about. So, when people began to understand determinism, they realized that these things are not happening due to some spirits moving about. So it was all determined by the necessary conditions. Well, but although some people thought that these things that happened in the world happened because of the presence of conditions. For example, they saw that birds could fly. And the human beings, when they see the birds flying, they also like to fly. Unfortunately, they didn't have the wings to fly. So what did they do? They observed how the flying takes place. What are the conditions necessary for these birds, maybe heavy birds, who are just floating in the air by just with the wings? How can that happen? And then they started experimenting and they discovered how to do it. So they made a machine that could fly. And today you find so many people can get into a plane and fly. So you see, when you understand how things happen, then it is possible for us to manipulate some of these things and at least do a certain amount of things. We can gain control over natural phenomena to some extent, not totally. Now, although most of these scientists and various people were able to understand how things happen in the world outside, people always thought that what is going on inside me is everything done by another spirit inside, which we call the soul, or some other word we might use. So, I am thinking, I am doing the thinking, I am doing the speaking, I am doing the acting. But then gradually, when this subject called psychology started, it started with the assumption that there was this soul inside. Because the word psych means the soul. Psychology is the study of the soul. But then they began to realize that even these things happening inside us is also determined by the presence of the necessary conditions. And they started talking about what is called psychic determinism. It was Freud who started using that term, psychic determinism. Which means that there is no person inside here to do these things. Now, when the radio begins to talk, there is no person inside that box. Or when you see television, people running about and talking and dancing and doing all kinds of things, but there are no people inside that. But when we see some person, which we call a human being, coming and talking to you, you think there must be a person inside. But if you understand that that is also psychic determinism, then you begin to understand that there is no spirit inside doing anything here. We are like robots. Only difference is that we are supposed to be living organisms rather than mechanical, non-living organisms. So this thing called life is a special process that is going on. That's why. Now the important thing to understand is that today, of course, according to the modern theory of evolution, the most evolved out of the animals is the human being. The human being is supposed to be the most evolved animal. But still, when we look at what the human being is doing, of course, with the human intelligence, now people have been able to even not only fly in the air, they have started going beyond the air to outer space. They have even gone to the moon. And they are sending some of these machines even to other planets, although human beings have not yet gone there. So they have made a lot of discoveries about the universe. But the point is, still they have not fully understood what is going on inside us, the mind. And the other thing is, we are also not only suffering due to things that are happening in the world, we are causing suffering to one another. We begin to kill people, hurt people, we begin to steal, we begin to do all kinds of crimes. And not only small crimes that affect one individual or just a few individuals, one or two. We are destroying whole nations and troubling people, wars, fighting. And ultimately we are in fear that some nuclear weapon will be destroying the whole world. So there has to be something going on where we should be able to evolve further beyond this level, to have peace in the world, to have happiness in the world. We are dreaming about some person like that. We see this person in the movies called a Superman. But when we think of this Superman, we are also thinking that this Superman came from some other planet. This is why some time back, and that whole talk was printed in the form of a small booklet. And the title of that talk was Man, Superman, and Beyond. Now what I said was that the Superman really lived on this earth more than 2,500 years ago. And that Superman was able to do various things like flying in the air, and also to have certain powers of recalling the past. And they also were able to see, like telescopic vision, microscopic vision, X-ray vision, and that sort of supernormal vision. These were the yogis of the past. Today in the modern world, these people have disappeared really, because people have changed. They have become more and more materialistic. They are more interested in sensual pleasures than this type of thing. That spiritual growth, evolution was to go beyond these sensual pleasures. The sensual pleasures is what is preventing us from growing up. It's like the child. The child is always, as Freud said, dominated by what is called the pleasure principle. And the adult, a grown-up adult, in the form of an emotionally mature person, is a person who is dominated by what Freud called the reality principle. That means we can't be all the time going after pleasures. We have to face reality and begin to control our emotional impulses. Otherwise, we'll be destroying one another. And not only that, we will be disappointed, unhappy. We begin to realize as adults. So this is why we need to grow up. This is what is the problem. And that is the evolution. This is the evolution of consciousness. That the human being has to evolve. And that evolution is the evolution of consciousness. And it is through this evolution that the human being begins to gain certain psychic powers, and that when you get the psychic powers, you have come to the level of Superman. And then you can go beyond that also. And that is where you begin to understand fully the problem of life. Even if you have psychic powers, still the problem of life has not been solved. Just like today, of course, you can press a button and the door opens. Like your garage door will open as you come on your car, press a button and it opens. So like that, you may be able to do certain things with all the technological power, I suppose. But even with these psychic powers, which are even superior to the technological powers, still you have not solved the problem. Because the problem is a struggle for existence, but no one survives. Although Darwin saw it as the struggle for existence and the survival of the fittest. But the real fact is, there is a struggle for existence and the survival of no one. No one really survives. So it's always a disappointment. We always have hope when we are children. We think, oh, when I grow up, I'll be able to do so many things. But you grow up and find that still you are like a child. You're not able to do much. And then you begin to pray to God. Maybe God can do it for us. You keep on praying till you die. That's how it is. Then you begin to think, well, after my afterlife, when I am somewhere after death, then I'll be having eternal life and eternal happiness. So this is all a dream. But when we go beyond the Superman stage, that becomes the stage when we really understand the problem of life and we are able to solve it. This is what happened to the Buddha. This is the meaning of Buddha. The Buddha means the awakened one. One who has awakened from the dream of existence. This is the main point here. We are dreaming. Although we think we are awake, we are really dreaming. We are dreaming of existence. But in this dream, still we discover that we are not existing. Because we die. Although we think of permanence, why do we think of permanence? We are thinking of two things which today scientists are talking about: space and time. Because there is space, we think we can travel. If you have money, you can travel anywhere, the whole world. But traveling the whole world means just turning round a ball, you see. It's a small ant insect. If you take a orange and this ant is going along this orange, it will never come to an end because it's going round and round. So in the same way, if we travel in the world outside, we'll be going round a whole huge ball. That's all that we are doing. Of course, if we can get into some kind of machine that goes to the moon, we might be able to go to the moon. But still we can't go beyond that. Maybe later time people might be able to go to some other planet also. But still, the problem is not solved. The important thing is, this is why once a certain person came to the Buddha and asked, if we travel in space outside, will we be able to come to the end of the world where there is no aging, no death? The Buddha said, no. And then he said, without reaching the end of the world, you will never be able to bring all suffering to an end. Then he said, the world, the beginning of the world, the end of the world, and the way leading to the end of the world is in this fathom-long body itself, with its perception and conception, consciousness. Now, some people say the Buddha was very silent about the creation of the world. He didn't tell or speak about how the world began. This is nonsense. The Buddha, that is the main thing that the Buddha spoke about. But it is very different from what other people are talking about. The Buddha pointed out that this whole world is a creation of our own minds. The mental process of perception itself is what creates the whole world, including ourselves. So it's not done by some external agent like the creator of the world who is doing this, but we ourselves are the creators. And the purpose of the teaching of the Buddha is to destroy this creation. So the Buddha becomes not the creator of the world, he becomes the destroyer of the world. What does that mean? Because this whole world is an illusion that we have created, and we are suffering as a result. It is only by getting rid of this illusion or delusion, really, that all suffering comes to an end. It cannot be done by traveling in the world or traveling in space. It can be done only by freeing our mind of this delusion. Now it's important to distinguish between these two words, illusion and delusion. Illusion is a perceptual fallacy, like seeing a mirage. That's an illusion. A delusion is a conceptual fallacy. forming a concept. So existence is a concept, not a percept. That's why. So that is why it is a delusion. So this is what a Buddha is, a person who has awakened from the dream of existence. And if we awaken from the dream of existence, we see that there is no such thing as existence. Now, if we are not existing, how can we die? We cannot die if we are not existing. That is the immortality that the Buddha spoke of. Normally people think life and death are opposites. Life is not the opposite of death. Death is a part of life. So when we are free of life, we are also free of death. Or when we are free of existence, we are free of death. Now, when we say we are free of existence or death, that doesn't mean that we are existing somewhere. So, nirvana is not an existence. It is not being eternal. Because even time and space, they are all creations of the mind. So when we are free of this, that is the meaning of nirvana. It is the stillness of the mind. It's all the activity of the mind that is doing all these things. The whole problem is an activity of the mind or the mental process. There is no such thing as mind. Even to talk about mind is not correct. Now, this is the awakening from the dream, and that is the ultimate stage in the process of evolution, the evolution of consciousness. So, I think that is the end of this talk. So, now is the time for you to talk, where you can ask questions and give your ideas, and we can discuss. So, but this is just the first lesson, huh? Maybe you like to go further and understand these other things. Next time we'll be talking more about a Buddha. What is a Buddha? That's important to know. But by now you at least know something about it. I want to talk about what is called Buddhology. Now, the theistic religions have this concept of God, and they have a thing called theology, where they talk about God. So, Buddhists also have a thing called Buddhology, which is also something similar to theology. And we can talk about it next time. And today we spoke about evolution. Of course, we can talk about it in much more detail, but I hope you understood most of it. And so when you ask the question, we can come out with more details about this. Yeah, we have been speaking for about 1.5 hours now, or at least close to it. Huh? So I don't want to bore you with just talking. So you can start talking, ask questions. I'll be very happy to answer the questions. Yeah?
Very good. Breaking with comfort. It's very hard. Whereas on the bit old crap, we talked about with the ship.
Yeah. The consciousness has to change. It's a transformation of the consciousness. So that is the beginning of what is called the Noble Eightfold Path. I don't really translate that as the Noble Eightfold Path. I call it the supernormal eightfold process. I call it supernormal, not noble. Supernormal means this is a way of understanding life which is not the normal way. It is going beyond the normal. So that also helps understand the Buddhist way of thinking, because it is also a kind of psychotherapy. How the modern psychologists talk about the abnormal people and the normal people. And they are trying to transform abnormal people into normal people. But the aim of the teaching of the Buddha is to transform normal people into supernormal people. So psychotherapy is to change abnormal suffering into normal suffering. That is what psychotherapy does normally. But the aim of Buddhism is to change normal suffering into supernormal happiness. That's the difference. Yeah?
And these shows give up desire, but even give up perfection to it. Lose it and never be straight. What wording was said, what give up will rhyme? What do you thought?
Very good. Good question. The important thing is that word desire itself is not the correct one. What is called tanha, sometimes people translate that as craving. I don't call it craving. It is simply the emotional urge, the emotional impulse. So what we have to do is to get rid of this emotional urge. So it's a matter of emotional management, I would call it. In other words, the emotions have to be, you have to understand that emotion is not some entity. It is simply the agitation of the mind, is an agitation. And what we have to do is to calm the mind. When the mind is calm, all emotions will disappear. It's the emotion that is creating the problem. It's preventing us from even seeing what is right and wrong, what is good and bad. It creates a confusion in the mind. That's what the emotion is doing. So normally people think emotion is a good thing. And exciting. Oh, how exciting it is. We want excitement. But that excitement itself is what has to be removed if we want to be happy. So true happiness is not an excitement. It's a state of tranquility of mind, a calmness. That's why people today, they want to learn to relax, and they take tranquilizers to tranquilize the mind. That means people have begun to appreciate tranquility. Yeah?
On to immersive, what we need to like absolutely that contemplation which the voice illustrates as blue, and that's not emotionally onto that. What is the correction taught?
That's also a good question. I have two important words you have to understand. One is reaction. The other is response. The reaction is an emotional excitement, agitation, and you are shouting and running about and doing all kinds of things. You might even kill people with this reaction. A response is a calm, thought out, rational action where you think and reason out. So, these psychologists talk about motivation, a thing called motivation, what makes you act. And one kind of motivation is this emotion. Emotional excitement can motivate you to do certain things. But there is another kind of motivation which is simply to stay calm and think rationally what is the best thing to do at this moment in this given situation, and you act in the rational way. This is what biologists, how they distinguish between the human being and other animals. One important distinction, which is the human being can delay the reaction to get sufficient time to decide which response to make in a given situation. But that doesn't mean that every human being does that all the time. This is where the human being has to evolve further. So if we ask what is the Buddha trying to do, we can say the Buddha is trying to make the human being evolve to a higher level where he becomes fully human, which means to be able to do that, to respond instead of reacting. If someone does some injustice to you, you begin to react, become angry and do all kinds of things. But if you can learn to stay calm, think properly, and act, that would be the right response. But you cannot predict what the situation is or how you should act in a given situation. there you have to use your own brain and think and reason out. You can give general principles, but to solve specific problems, you will have to use your own brain. That's the important thing. So response is an intellectual action, whereas a reaction is an emotional behavior. I hope that made it clear to some extent at least.
Hello?
Yeah? Can you speak a little loud? My ear is not properly working.
How do you solve some?
How do you grow up to that point? Well, the best thing is learn to gain control over the emotion. This is also a very important question. Sigmund Freud was a clever man, although some people don't like him. He saw this problem. He divided the personality into three parts. One part he called the id, the other part he called the ego, and the third part he called the superego. The id represented the emotional part, the emotional excitements, the emotions, which always seek pleasure and try to avoid pain. So the id was dominated by what he called the pleasure principle. The ego was the rational part. Now, he didn't mean the soul or anything like that by using that word ego. I suppose he used it because Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. So the I was given over to the rational part, the thinking part. The emotion was the feeling part. So the ego was the rational part. And then he also spoke about another thing, which was the superego. And the superego was simply what is called the conscience. As you bring up a child, as the child begins to grow up, the elders or the mother and father or whoever is looking after the child will say, no, don't do that, that's bad, that's wrong, you should do this. And as a result, the child begins to incorporate those ideas, and that begins to rule that person's life. That is the conscience. So the conscience is what makes you feel guilty. You begin to feel guilty when you do a wrong thing. That's because the conscience is pricking you. So these are the three things. So certain emotional excitements, or you have a desire, for example, sexual activity you have, and then the conscience says, no, that's wrong. You feel guilty. And so, because of this, the ego will start suppressing or repressing the id. Now that repression begins to create problems, like perversions and all kinds of neurotic behavior is a result of this repression. So the problem is, now, is that the correct thing to do? To start suppressing or repressing? Or the other thing is to give in to these emotions? Both are incorrect. So Freud suggested there is a middle path, but his middle path was what he called sublimation. He used the word sublimation. So what he called sublimation was to give vent to this in a socially acceptable way. If you are angry with a person, some person did some injustice to you or something like that, and you want to take revenge on that person, don't go and fight, don't go and shoot that person or do anything. You just go to courts, pay a lawyer and do something. A lawyer will gain that. A thing like that is sublimation. You see, to express your emotions in a socially acceptable way. Or a young man goes on the road and finds a beautiful girl and wants to have some sexual relationship or something. Don't rape that person, but you go and talk to that person and try to get married. Now, this is the socially acceptable way. You see, that sort of thing is the sublimation. But you know, if you have read the first sermon of the Buddha, there he says, there are two extremes to be avoided. One is devotion to sensual pleasure, is one extreme. That means to be carried away by the id, in Freudian language. The other extreme is self-mortification or asceticism, which is the idea of repression and suppression from a Freudian way of thinking, dominated by the superego. Then he says there is a middle way that he has discovered, and that middle way is what he calls the Noble Eightfold Path. And that middle way is really beginning with right understanding. If you are familiar with the Noble Eightfold Path, you know it begins with right understanding. And what is right understanding is to understand the problem and find the solution. There is one important thing that Freud missed, and that is why he didn't see the real solution. He saw it only as sublimation in that way, which was just not a full solution. This is why Freud had to write another book, which he called Civilization and its Discontents. To be civilized is to be discontent. Because, you see, a man might want to have several wives, but to civilize is to have only one wife. That is, he's not happy. You see, this is the problem. So it's not only the man's problem. Sometimes wives also want several husbands and cannot have, because the law says only one. So monogamy, you can't have polygamy. So this is to be civilized is to be unhappy. That's what he pointed out. And that's why these other problems today we find, which is called stress. The problem of stress. And so you have to pay a lot of money to learn stress management. And, and even after that, you are not able to manage your stress. You have lost your money. So this is a problem that the important thing that the Buddha discovered was that this conflict that Freud was talking about can be easily solved. This is the same problem that the Buddha was talking about. The solution is to realize that we don't have these things called instincts. This is the mistake that Freud made. Instinct is supposed to be born inside. You have certain emotions inside. They have to find an expression somehow. That is not true. He found that we do in our body have all the necessary hormones and all the organs necessary to start an emotional excitement. But that excitement can be started only through stimulation of the senses. It's the sensory stimulation. Freud saw that, but he didn't see it properly. Now, if you can learn to control the reaction to the stimulus, then you can be free of the emotion. And the emotion can be removed by learning to relax and calm down. That is what these stress management experts are saying also. The important thing is that. And gradually, modern psychology is gradually turning towards Buddhism now. That's the other point about it. Now there is a school of psychology called cognitive psychology. And they have what is called cognitive therapy. They have begun to realize that the emotions start not from inside, it comes from the way you think. The thinking is the important thing. And if you can change your thinking, the emotions will disappear and you can have a calm mind, tranquil mind. This is why the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path begins with right thinking, right understanding. So it's very important to understand these things, which we'll discuss later. Huh? You have something to say? Yeah, you can ask.
And making this days are admitted to the being posted in the innocent days in terms of words something to your pod. As the mind of like a great day. Lots of it's the head. Listen to the part and now let my innovate great.
Well, that is another kind of modern thinking, listening to the heart. No, we have to understand what we mean by heart and what we mean by head. This is very important. The Buddha, referring to the mind, he used 3 words, very important. Chitta, Mano, and Vijnana. Chitta refers to what is called the heart. Mano refers to what is called the head. And Vijnana refers to the senses. Now that means the sensory activity, or what we call perception, is the vijnana. But today it is wrongly translated as consciousness. Vijnana is not consciousness. Vijnana is perception. That means seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching. And also forming a concept, like I see an object, maybe a cushion. When I say I see a cushion, that is perception. That is the vijnana. Once we have perceived something, then we begin to interpret what we have perceived. We begin to give a meaning to what we have seen. And according to how we interpret what we have seen, we become emotionally excited. Now that interpretation part is the formation of concepts, is what is called mano. And that is what we call the head. That is a brain activity of this, what is called the cerebral cortex, the brain activity. That is the mano. Now once we have formed a concept and interpreted what we saw, what happens? The brain sends a message. Say, if you become angry, that means you have interpreted a situation in a certain way, and the brain sends a message to the adrenal gland, and a hormone called adrenaline will be secreted into the blood, and that goes to various parts of the body. And different parts of the body, some parts become overactive, some parts become underactive. And this activity of the body in this way is what we call an emotion. Is correct in a way, because even the Buddhists say this chitta is associated with the blood in the heart. And that is true. It's what is called in biological terms, it's the endocrine system. That whole endocrine system is responsible for the emotion. Because the hormone secreted by the endocrine gland is producing this whole thing. But that came into being only because of how you interpreted a situation. And this emotional excitement, of course, several things happen inside the body, but one important thing that happens in every emotion, whether it is anger, or whether it is a sexual desire, or whether it is fear or worries, one important thing happens. The muscles become tense. That tension in the muscle. And the more the muscles become tensed, what happens? You begin to feel uncomfortable. So the discomfort is there whether you desire something pleasant or whether you hate something unpleasant, whether you fear something or whether you are worried about something, that discomfort is there. This is what today people talk about when they talk about stress. That tension is producing the discomfort, and that discomfort can be got rid of by releasing the tension in action. So you release the tension in action to obtain what you desire, to get rid of what you hate, or to run away from what you fear. That's called the fight and flight response. Right? And then, of course, you feel happy now because your tension is released. So even after killing a person, you can feel happy because the tension is released. But the problem is, you can't be going about killing people and fighting and quarreling all the time. And you can't have everything that you desire. You can't get that. And then what happens is the tension remains unreleased. This is what is called stress. The tension gets on accumulate. And the time comes when you break down. It's called a nervous breakdown. Now, this is the suffering that the Buddha spoke of. And what the Buddha pointed out was, you don't have to release the tension in action to obtain what you desire, or to get rid of what you hate, or to run away from what you fear. That's not what you have to do. Observe the tension. Become aware of the emotional excitement. And learn to relax consciously. It's the releasing unconsciously. That unconscious release is an unconscious thing. Whereas if you become aware of this consciously, then you can learn to relax the tension. And when you relax the tension, again you feel comfortable and happy. And not only that, you can also learn to prevent the tension coming up. You can learn to prevent the emotional excitement by what is called guarding the senses, is because the whole thing starts at the senses. So when you learn to guard your senses, you can learn to get rid of your emotion, and then you'll remain happy all the time. This is what is given in the Noble Eightfold Path. That's the solution to the problem that the Buddha pointed out. But it has to be done by yourself. You can't get someone else to do it. It's not like a massage or something like that. Yes. So this is the important thing. The Buddha, he is called the savior of the world, but not a person who saves by using his powers, but by using his wisdom and telling people what to do. Because you have to save yourself. You become your own savior. That's the important thing. Fair? So it's a good question you asked, and that's why when you ask questions, then the details come out. You have a question? No, you understood, huh? Good. So, if you don't have any further question, we can bring the day to an end. So, I am very happy that you came, and I hope you understood something. And if you want to understand further, you should come again And also, it's good if you can come to every talk. Otherwise, if you come only to a few talks, you won't be able to get the whole story. So it's good if you can come. And so we'll see you, we'll expect you to come, and we'll see you next time in with better understanding, growth, huh? And so I wish you the best of everything. And if you also want to make any donations, you can. There is a box somewhere waiting. You can put your donations there, huh? And we are not asking for donations as such. If you like to give, you can give. If you don't like to give, you can also go without giving. So wish you all the best, and I will chant a blessing to bless you all, and keep your palms together and listen with devotion. Bhavatu sabba mangalang rakkandu sabba devata sabba buddhano bhavena sada sotti bhavantu te. Bhavatu sabba mangalang rakkantu sabba devata sabba dhammano bhavena sada sotti bhavantu te. Bhavatu sabba mangalang rakkantu sabba devata sabba sanghanubhavena sada sotti bhavantu te. May you all be well, comfortable, peaceful, and happy. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay.